Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and in this episode, I am doing something that is actually a request. I kind of put that out on social media, on Facebook, and other areas that I was wondering what topics folks would like me to cover. And I've gotten an interesting list of topics that I have kept and I have a copy of. And I'm going to go through that list and try my best to kind of address as much as I possibly can. But in this video, interestingly enough, there was a request to cover Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, and how might we break this argument down in an easy to understand way and within the context of kind of like a presuppositional approach. So I thought that was really interesting. I very much enjoy Alvin Plantinga's work, and I thought that this would be a good topic for this video. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video today, and I'm not sure how long we're going to go in this episode, but I'll try to cover kind of the main content of what I want to cover here, and then maybe take a question, and then we'll kind of wrap things up from there. So now, kind of starting fresh, if you don't know who Alvin Plantinga is, I think there is, it'd be appropriate here to kind of give some background here. So Alvin Plantinga is considered to be one of the most respected Christian philosophers of the 20th, 21st centuries, easily. Very, very influential Christian thinker. He taught at Calvin College and the University of Notre Dame, and has made massive contributions to the philosophy of religion, areas of epistemology and metaphysics. So he's kind of very influential on kind of a wide range of philosophical topics. He's most notably popular for, for the revitalization of Christian philosophy in the analytic philosophical tradition. Okay, so if anyone's familiar with kind of different philosophical schools, if you're familiar with kind of like Cornelius Van Til or someone like that, Van Til would be considered a continental philosopher. And the interesting thing about continental philosophy is that continental philosophy in that tradition is very much concerned with kind of like big picture concerns. That's why Van Til typically spoke a lot about kind of like worldviews and entire paradigms. Whereas when you look within the analytic tradition, it's more specific. It is very much concerned with defining categories, rigorous logical argumentation, very specific use of kind of deductions and linguistic analysis and these sorts of things. Definitely within the tradition of, say, if you were to think of someone opposite of like Van Til in terms of like their broad category, Van Til is of the continental philosophical tradition, but someone like Greg Bahnsen he was an analytic philosopher with a focus on epistemology, a theory of knowledge. So, you take someone like Greg Bahnsen, someone like James Anderson, who's been on the show before. Those are analytically minded philosophers within that specific school. Alvin Plantinga, within the focus of the philosophy of religion, he is in the analytic tradition. So very clear thinker. Obviously, I don't agree with him on everything, obviously, but he is definitely a very, very brilliant guy, and has kind of developed some very helpful things that can be used within the context of apologetics. Okay, but he is obviously, if you're familiar with the free will defense in response to the problem of evil, that's Plantinga. Plantinga is very noted in that area. Okay, but today we're going to be focusing on a different contribution, and that is his argument, which is typically called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Now, Plantinga's argument here is what we would call on this channel and within kind of just philosophical discourse is what we call an internal critique, right? So he steps inside the worldview of the atheist, the evolutionary naturalist, okay? You want to think in terms specifically, his argument is geared towards, those who hold to kind of like naturalism and evolution, right? And he tries to show that these two beliefs are at odds with each other. That's an internal critique, right? That is to say, that if you believe both in naturalism, that there is no God, only the physical world exists, matter and motion, this kind of thing, and you believe in evolution, okay, then there's good reason to doubt the reliability of your own reasoning faculties. So as you would imagine, if you're familiar with kind of presuppositional apologetics and attempted internal critiques, you would imagine that is, something that might be useful to kind of, understand how all of that plays out. Okay. So the question then kind of comes up. If your brain is just the result of blind evolutionary forces, right? And there's no God directing the process and so forth, right? Then why should we trust anything our brains tell us, including, our belief in naturalism and evolution, right? So again, this becomes this becomes a possible problem for the adherent to naturalistic atheism and evolutionary theory. And so again, whether it's successful or not, that's obviously going to be hashed out in the discourse and, when you're in conversations and so forth. But me personally, if I give you a spoiler alert, I do think that it is a good critique. I do know that there are folks who have responded to it and things like that. And that's definitely worth jumping into for more in-depth study. Dr. Greg Bahnsen was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bahnsen U. Bahnsen U aims to bring seminary-level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bahnsen U Plus and Bahnsen U Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. But let's break this down into kind of 4 basic steps, and hopefully I can make this as simple as I can, okay? So naturalism, just popularly defined, naturalism is the belief that nature is all there is, right? There's nothing transcendent, right? And nothing that goes beyond what we, our universe, things are matter in motion. Naturalism is very much associated with materialism and things like that, but it doesn't have to be, all right? If nature is all there is, there are some people who believe that there are immaterial facets to nature, and therefore they're not necessarily materialist. So how you define these categories are going to be very dependent upon kind of the specific nuances of the person that you're talking to. But generally, we could understand naturalism is, nature is all there is. There is nothing transcendent beyond nature, okay? Evolution in this context would be referred to kind of the unguided Darwinian process of evolution, okay? And so, this is not going to be a video about evolution per se, but assuming many of you know what evolution is, just be very careful. Evolution, the term, is a broad term. So, you can think of evolution in terms of different kinds and different emphasis. You have macroevolution, you have microevolution, you have, Stephen Jay Gould's, punctuated equilibrium. So it's a very nuanced term. Broadly speaking, we can speak of evolution, and even at that level, Christians, people who would hold to say like 6-day creation, would affirm some aspects of evolution, and then other aspects of evolution would be rejected. Okay, so it all depends on how you're using your terms. It's very, very important to define your terms. Okay, now, if naturalism and evolution are true, okay, then what Plantinga points out is that our cognitive faculties are aimed at survival, not truth, right? Evolution cares about whether you survive and reproduce, not whether your beliefs are true. So for example, if I believe there's a tiger behind the bush and I run, right, that helps me survive, even if there's not a tiger behind the bush, okay? As long as my behavior is advantageous, evolution doesn't really care whether the belief behind the behavior is accurate, okay? And that seems to be true. Evolution is geared towards survival, not true belief. So if evolution selects for adaptive behavior and not true belief, then there's no guarantee that our beliefs, including our scientific and philosophical beliefs, are true. So you can't if these implications are accurate, that would include all of the things that we believe, whether they're basic beliefs or philosophical beliefs or beliefs about certain scientific theories or paradigms. All of the beliefs would be encompassed in that. Okay. Now, if you have good reason to doubt the reliability of your cognitive faculties, then you have a defeater for everything that you believe, including naturalism and evolution, right? And so if your belief-forming mechanisms are not trustworthy, then all your beliefs, including your belief in naturalism and evolution, they seem to be undermined. Okay, that's kind of the thrust of Plantinga's point here. So Plantinga calls this a defeater, a belief that defeats itself. And so you can't consistently believe in naturalism and evolution and also trust your own reasoning that got you there. Okay, that's kind of the thought process behind this. Now, if we can kind of conclude based on those steps that I just went through, naturalism and evolution together then are self-defeating according to this line of reasoning. If you hold both naturalism and evolution, you've given yourself a reason to distrust your own beliefs, which include the belief in naturalism and evolution. And it's kind of an undercutting, it's kind of a self-refuting point at this juncture, okay? It's kind of like sawing the branch that you're sitting off, right? You're sitting on, okay? I said that right? It's like cutting off the branch that you are sitting on. I think I said the saying right? So that's kind of the overall summary of what the evolutionary argument against naturalism is trying to do. Now, let's kind of contextualize this then. So let's take this argument and kind of plug it into a presuppositional method. And I think this is what the person who suggested this topic is really looking for. How might we take this and contextualize it within a presuppositional framework? And I highly recommend folks do this. There was another suggestion of a video that I do showing the virtues of, other apologetic methods like the classical and the evidential method. Someone asked, "Hey, Eli, is there any aspect of those methodologies that you agree with? What are the strengths of those other methodologies?" Now, this video is not covering that directly, but I might as well address this here because it's relevant. I think methodologies that are grounded in that they're the fundamental foundation of those methodologies, I think, are grounded in categories of autonomy and neutrality, and therefore they're not good methodologies. That is not to say that the specific things that they've dealt with, like specific evidences or specific various, philosophical arguments, haven't been helpful. They have been. And so what I like to do is I like to take the benefits of, some of those evidential and classical kinds of arguments and contextualize them within a framework that I think is more consistent with kind of biblical categories and are more philosophically cogent. Okay. And in that sense, I think, Alvin Plantinga is not a Van Tillian. Okay. But I think there is some benefit in taking some of his insights and contextualizing them within what we would take to be a more biblical framework. And so I think that's kind of what we're doing here. So what Plantinga has done, I think brilliantly, is to show that the atheist, the naturalistic, evolutionary kind of perspective collapses under its own weight. I think he's done a good internal critique, which is exactly what we do as presuppositionalists. So there's definitely something to grab on there and to grab onto there and to benefit from. Now, here's the key. And this is what makes Plantinga distinct from, say, someone like a Van Til or a Bahnsen or someone along those lines, okay? Plantinga, I don't think, goes all the way, right? He leaves the door open to theism generally. And this is kind of the critique that presuppositionalists have with the evidential kinds of arguments and the classical arguments, is that there is always this pushing for a sort of general theism. And that's not what we're arguing for in terms of the transcendental argument, okay? The transcendental argument, at least as how Van Til intended to use it and Bahnsen intended to use it, it is not an argument for general theism, right? Broadly speaking, it is an argument for Christian theism specifically. If you guys remember, if you listened to the Gordon Stein debate that Dr. Bahnsen did all those years ago, I think 1985, Dr. Bahnsen's clearly said that he was arguing for Christian theism, okay? And so it is a very specific argument, arguing for a very specific God, not God, broadly speaking, kind of empty, we can use the word God, but like, what do we mean by that, right? The Christian has a very specific content in how we're using the word God. And so I don't think Plantinga goes far enough, right? We as presuppositionalists are going to want to take it further, and we're going to argue not just for some God, but for the triune God of Scripture as the necessary precondition for intelligibility. So what do we do then with Alvin Plantinga's argument? Well, first, we can show that atheism, naturalistic, evolutionary perspective, and the atheistic perspective, it undercuts reason through naturalism plus evolution when you put those together. So when you put naturalism together, okay, if naturalism is true, by the way, then theism is false. Okay, that just to give you that context there. So you put naturalism together and evolution together, that form of atheism, Plantinga argues, undercuts reason, and I think he does it successfully. Okay. The second point here, the Christian worldview alone can account for trustworthy cognitive faculties because we're made in the image of a rational God. Okay, if you're an atheist, you don't have to accept that, but when you reject it and you remain in the atheistic, naturalistic, evolutionary paradigm, then you have to deal with the fact that that seems to undercut reason, okay, or undercut the general reliability of our cognitive faculties, okay? For the Christian, I mean, it's simple, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, right? You can't even account for reasoning without starting with God, okay? Now, when I say starting with God, I'm not going to get into the whole side issue. I've done a whole video on what we mean by starting with God. So if you're thinking about that and you're like, oh, what do you mean by that? That's been critiqued. We've covered that a bajillion times in this video, in this channel, and so I'm not going to belabor that point. But when the atheist says, I believe in science, I believe in logic, I believe in evidence, right? We need to ask on what basis, right? If your brain is the product of unguided forces, then how do you know your reasoning is reliable? Now, I'm not saying that the unbeliever's reasoning is unreliable. I understand that unbelievers reason, and they often reason very well. But if we hypothetically grant the atheistic, naturalistic, evolutionary picture on that basis, on that assumption, how do you know your reasoning is reliable? Okay, that's a fair question. Okay, and so naturalist has to be able to give a justification, a response to these sorts of questions. Now, I think that's where Plantinga's argument really kind of hits the nail on the head. It gets the atheist to see, hopefully, that the worldview that they are propounding doesn't justify the very tools that they're using to argue against God. And so hopefully you can kind of see the transcendental thrust to that, if that makes sense. Okay, so what does this look like in conversation? Okay, now this is not super sophisticated. I'm just giving kind of an example, in a practical sense. I'm not trying to give a, very sophisticated explanation here that's not open to any object. I mean, obviously people are going to object, right? But take this for what it's worth, just in terms of teaching purposes, right? What does this look like in the real world? Well, we don't have to get super technical, right? You can present Plantinga's argument within kind of the presuppositional framework in a very conversational tone, I mean, you could say to someone, hey, let me ask you a question, right? Okay. You believe in naturalism and evolution, right? Right? That our brains came from unguided evolutionary processes. Pardon? Right? So evolution cares about survival, not truth, right? And so if that's true, then how do you know the beliefs in your brain produces actually true beliefs? Like your belief in naturalism and evolution. That's a simple question, okay? Now, of course, wait for the answer. They might give a wide variety of answers. It really depends on who you're talking to, but you want to let those kind of questions linger and have give someone to think about. Introducing All Access, your premium gateway to deeper apologetic and theological insights. Through Q&A sessions, theological lectures, and exclusive bonus content, All Access takes your learning to the next level. Support the ministry of Apologia Studios while unlocking incredible resources like Ask Me Anything, which is an interactive live stream featuring Jeff Durbin. We have the Academy featuring theological lectures from leading experts and exclusive content from shows like Apologia Radio and Cultish. With more exciting content on the way, there's never been a better time to join. Visit apologiastudios.com and click join to get started today. When we kind of plant that question and we can then further ask, wouldn't that give you reason to doubt everything your brain tells you, including your belief in atheism, right? Or in evolution or whatever. And then you can pivot and see, well, I believe my mind was created by a rational God who made me in his image, and that's why I can trust my reason. But if our minds are just the result of chance and survival, I don't really see how you could ever know anything for sure. Okay, there you go. I mean, that's just in a conversational context. That's kind of the route you could take in a casual conversation. Okay, so I think that Plantinga here gives us a very useful philosophical tool. I think as presuppositionalists, right, we sharpen it and aim it squarely at the heart of the unbeliever's worldview, not out of arrogance or anything like that, but because we want to get the point across. We want to show the insufficiency of the unbelieving worldview and then put forth the Christian perspective. Okay, and so the message here is simple: atheism cannot support reason, but Christianity can. Only in Christ are we able to make sense of our thoughts, our minds, science, our search for truth. That makes sense within a Christian theistic perspective, okay? And so the next time someone says, well, I don't believe in God, right? I believe in reason, or if you want to quote, Esqueleto from Nacho Libre, right? I don't believe in God, I believe in science, right? then you want to, at that point, show them that reason presupposes God, right? So someone might ask then, okay, well, come on, man. Okay, surely this argument doesn't work, right? Just because evolution selects for survival doesn't mean it only gives us false beliefs. If your beliefs consistently lead to successful behavior, we'll be told, then they're probably true. And so evolution can still give us reliable cognitive faculties even without your God. Okay, so someone could say that, right? So at this point, we want to slow down and kind of take that objection and kind of work with it, okay? And so this is kind of one of the most common responses to Plantinga's argument here, and I think it's important that we don't misrepresent it. We're not, interested in presenting a straw man, but I'm also not interested in giving an in-depth analysis here. I'm just kind of giving an overview as to what someone might say and how we might respond to it, if that makes sense, okay? And then you guys could debate it in the comments. Okay. All right. So someone could say true beliefs are more adaptive. So evolution likely gives us reliable minds. Okay. So the naturalist can argue that true beliefs tend to produce successful behavior, and therefore evolution would, over time, select for truth-tracking cognitive faculties. So, for example, if I believe that cliffs are dangerous, and that belief leads me to kind of trying to avoid falling off them, then that belief helps me survive. So maybe evolution does select for truth kind of in an indirect way, okay? Or they might appeal to, evolutionary epistemologists, people like Patricia Churchland, who suggest that while evolution doesn't select for truth per se, it selects for behavior that tracks the truth well enough to aid survival. And so the idea is that evolution gives us approximations of truth, and that's enough to get by. And of course, that kind of sounds reasonable at first glance, but again, we're going to have some issues here. Another objection might come up in response to what we said is that we test our beliefs. We have science, right? That's enough, okay? So someone could say, even if evolution didn't give us, perfectly reliable minds, we have the scientific method, right? We have methods of verification. Okay, through repeated testing, peer review, falsification, observation, all these things, we can weed out false beliefs and get closer to the truth. Okay, and so even if our brains aren't infallible, we'll be told, they can still be trustworthy enough, thanks to the corrective mechanisms that we have in science. And so we don't need God to do that. We just need rigorous thinking and data, peer reviewed, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and so some atheists they might even ask, look, we've landed people on the moon, right? Our belief-forming mechanisms clearly seem to work. So they might kind of point to the practical successes of science to kind of undergird this point. Or, someone could say that if evolution undercuts trust in our reasoning, wouldn't that be true for everyone, including Christians, right? Even if God exists, right? How do you know he gave you reliable faculties? How do you escape the same skepticism that you're applying to the naturalist, the evolutionist, the atheist, right? And so they can show, they might say this to show that, maybe Plantinga is smuggling in a kind of global skepticism and then just arbitrarily trusting that God makes it all okay, something like that, right? But again, you want to be able to kind of catch that, right? Someone's like, well, maybe there's a smuggled presupposition. You want to be forthright with your presuppositions as Christians here. So these are kind of the possible kind of responses that people could make. But how do we respond to this? Okay, here's the thing: when we press deeper, especially from kind of a presuppositional perspective, we see that these responses that I kind of just hypothetically gave here, they don't actually work. Okay, they actually indirectly borrow capital from the Christian worldview even to get off the ground. And so let's kind of like unpack this here. So, why do these perspectives fall short? And why is it the case that only the biblical worldview provides a coherent foundation for rational thought and a foundation for, the general reliability of our cognitive faculties? Okay, let's take a look. Okay, from a presuppositional perspective, we want to do more than just, poke holes in naturalism, right? We want to ask the deeper question that Plantinga's argument points us toward, but doesn't answer. I think it doesn't go far enough because he's kind of arguing for like the falsity of naturalism, and then of course the suggestion of general theism as being kind of the best option. Okay, and I think this is where the transcendental thrust of the presuppositional method really becomes helpful. So we ask the question, a more fundamental question: what must be true of the world for our reasoning to even be possible in the first place? Okay, basically we're asking, what are the preconditions? What are the necessary preconditions for reasoning. Okay. Now, for the Christian, the answer is going to be consistent all the way through. It is the triune God who's revealed himself both in general and special revelation, right? It's the Christian worldview, the truth of the Christian worldview that provides a basis for these things. Okay. So, evolution gives us mostly true beliefs because true beliefs lead to survival. Okay. Here's the problem with this point is not guaranteed. Okay. The connection between true belief and survival advantage is not a necessary connection. Isn't that right? Evolution selects for behavior. It doesn't select for beliefs. And many false beliefs can produce adaptive behavior. Think about it. A person might survive by believing something false as long as their behavior turns out to be useful. For example, someone might believe that every time they step on a crack, they'll break their mother's back. You ever hear that, right? So they avoid cracks, all right? Now, imagine there's actually a landmine hidden under one of the cracks. That false belief just saved their life. So there you go. The box is checked. Survival is achieved. Truth not required, okay? But what does that mean? You see, it means that there is no necessary connection between the evolutionary process and truth-tracking cognitive faculties. You're just left hoping that evolution happened to produce reliable reasoning in this specific case. And that's not a rational foundation. That's wishful thinking. As Greg Bonson would say, you're sitting on God's lap to slap him in the face, right? You don't have a strong foundation, but then you kind of borrow from another perspective to kind of say, look, here's what we're doing. It produces this, or this works. Okay. And that's not a strong foundation. Okay. Now, what if someone says, but science helps us correct false beliefs? Okay. Well, let's step back from this. How do you even trust your ability to do science in the first place? Right? What are the necessary preconditions for science? Okay. Now, you want to be very careful here because I have heard some atheists say science has no presuppositions. And of course, that's demonstrably false. That's just so philosophically naive, okay? The scientific method, in order for us to use it, it presupposes the reliability of our senses, the reliability of our memory, the validity of inductive reasoning, the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, all of these things, okay? If someone presents science as this completely and utterly neutral, category, then they evidence their philosophical naivete and they evidence their inherent non-neutral perspective in that when you assert neutrality, you are not neutral against positions that say you can't be neutral, all right? That's why we say neutrality is a myth, okay? But again, when you take these preconditions of science, reliability of senses, memory, validity of inductive reasoning, laws of logic, uniformity of nature, etc., none of these are grounded in naturalism, right? The naturalist often just assumes these things or stipulates them as kind of a brute fact, There is no reason under naturalism. There's no reason why, tomorrow should be anything like, or tomorrow would be anything like today, right? There's no basis, no foundation for induction. There is no reason why our brains formed by blind processes should track truth or yield a coherent logical inference. If nature is all there is, there's no transcendent standard of logic to appeal to, just chemical reactions firing off in your skull, okay? And so you see, science isn't the solution to the problem. It depends on the very rationality that the naturalist worldview can't account for. They're using the tools of a Christian worldview while denying the toolbox. Okay? So I think it's a very important thing to keep in mind there. So someone could say, but how do you know God gave you reliable faculties? Aren't you just assuming Christianity is, you're assuming Christianity at that point? And again, yes, we presuppose the truth of the Christian worldview, but we don't do it arbitrarily. Now, I get it. The skeptics, it is arbitrary. It's not. You can say it's arbitrary, but I bet you can't demonstrate it's arbitrary because it's not. We're giving a justification as to why we are presupposing the Christian worldview, okay? And repeating the claim, well, that's just a claim. The fact that you can't understand how we are justifying that claim is irrelevant or unrelated to the fact that it does. We don't have to, because you don't understand the argument, right? Doesn't mean that we can't use the argument, okay? When we say that we presuppose the truth of the Christian worldview and it is demonstrated transcendentally, that's not simply a claim. If you continually say it's just a claim, then you're just kind of repeating yourself. I mean, if you understand what the even if the transcendental argument was not a good argument, it's still easy to differentiate between making a bare assertion and making an attempted justification for that assertion that we're making. Maybe you think the justification is false. But to say it's not, no justification is offered, I mean, and just repeat, that's not, it's just a claim, it's just a claim. I mean, that's on you. You can say that. I mean, it's not going to get very far in discussion if you're going to just repeat that over. I mean, I could do that too. Why think evolution is true? And then you'd be like, oh, and then you appeal to all these, well, those are just claims. No, but it can be demonstrated. Oh, but those demonstrated just claim. Obviously, that wouldn't be appropriate for me to do. Okay. There is a demonstration attempted when someone says, I think evolution is true. I don't just ignore what scientists say. I have to evaluate their arguments, their data, the interpretation of their data. And then eventually we're going to get pushed back to the issue of worldview, and we're right there debating over paradigms at that point. Okay. So yes, we presuppose the truth of the Christian worldview. We don't do it arbitrarily. We do it transcendentally, because unless the God of Scripture exists, nothing can be known at all. That is the argument. Okay. I'm not going to go over how we justify it. I did a whole video on that. And even after doing that, people say, well, you didn't address the issue. Of course, someone naturally would say that, right? If you don't agree with me, right? But deal with the specifics. Don't just say that I didn't deal with it. Deal with the specific things that were stated. Okay. Now, pardon. So, on a Christian perspective, we have a personal, rational creator who designed us in his image. We have a creation that operates in a consistent, law-like way, and minds that are made to understand and interpret the world that God has made, right? We don't claim to build knowledge from the ground up and then add God as a conclusion. No, from the Christian perspective, we begin with the fear of the Lord as the starting point, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That is to be consistent with the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview has the resources to undergird and provide a foundation for those presuppositions of the very scientific method that people appeal to, like, oh, look at how practically useful it is, so on and so forth. Okay? So to the naturalist who says, well, you're just assuming God, we say, yes, we're assuming God, but we're not just assuming him like as though it's kind of like arbitrary, right? We argue that without him, you couldn't rationally understand or provide a justification for anything. Okay. But we do understand stuff. We do science. Yes, you do it. I agree. Okay. But what is the justification for what you're doing? Can you make sense out of the presuppositions necessary to do the very things that you claim you're doing? That's the point. Okay. Plantinga's argument gets you to the edge of the cliff, showing that naturalism undercuts rationality. But I think the presuppositionalist pushes a little further and shows that only Christian theism secures the ground beneath your feet. Okay, so let's kind of tie this together here then. Plantinga showed that naturalistic evolution leads to skepticism about our own minds, okay, or we argue that he's shown. I think he's successfully shown. Obviously, there's going to be people who disagree, but the naturalist tries to patch it up with probability, pragmatism, appeals to science and so forth, but none of that works unless they first assume what only the Christian worldview provides. A rational God who makes rational minds makes rational mind and places us within a rational universe, okay? Without the God of the Bible, you're left with cognitive luck, philosophical guesswork, and no basis for trusting your thoughts, including your belief that God doesn't exist, okay? And so if you're watching this as a skeptic, I'd encourage you, stop trying to reason in midair. Stop borrowing from the Christian worldview while denying the source, okay? Only by acknowledging your creator, the triune God of Scripture, can you truly make sense of reason, science, truth, and all the things that you want in your worldview. And to my fellow believers, let this strengthen your confidence, right? We don't argue from neutrality. We argue from the rock-solid foundation of God's revelation. And from that vantage point, we can show that the impossibility of the contrary leaves the unbeliever without excuse, okay? So again, I hope this kind of makes sense in terms of breaking these ideas down. I think we have time for one question. Let me see. We got a few minutes here, and then I got to head out and wrap things up. But so someone asked, let's see here. Someone asked, true beliefs can have survival value. Therefore, evolution explains all of this just fine. Right. Okay. So, true beliefs I would admit that true beliefs often help us survive. Okay. So if I believe that walking into traffic is dangerous and that belief keeps me alive, right, then it looks like truth and survival go hand in hand. So, someone might say, doesn't that mean that evolution can produce reliable cognitive faculties? Okay. And I would say not so fast. I don't think that goes far enough at all. You see, the problem isn't that true beliefs can't be adaptive. They often are, right? The issue is that naturalistic evolution doesn't require them to be. In fact, Evolutionary theory, when stripped of when it's coming from a worldview that's stripped of divine guidance and only selects for behavior and not belief content, I think that's a problem. Okay, let's take an example. Imagine a person who believes that running from tigers is good because it earns them cosmic brownie points in the afterlife. Just whatever, right? Maybe if someone believes that's a totally false belief, but the behavior, right, the running is survival enhancing, and so that person survives, passes on their genes, and natural selection is satisfied at that point. Okay, now evolution doesn't care if the belief is true; it only cares if the belief works. So sure, sometimes true beliefs help survival. But under naturalism, there's no guarantee, no necessary connection between a belief being true and it being selected. And so when you add up the thousands of beliefs we all hold, that uncertainty becomes a real problem. How do you know your belief forming faculties are truth tracking, and generally speaking, and not just producing useful fictions? That's a fair question. And so this is where the Christian worldview has, I think, a decisive advantage. The reliability of our cognitive faculties isn't a lucky accident within the Christian worldview. It's part of the design. We're made in the image of a rational, truth-loving God, and that's why we could expect our minds to correspond, at least in part, to reality. So while the naturalist says, hey, sometimes truth helps us survive, the Christian says, yeah, but only because God made a world where truth and survival were meant to go together. That makes sense within a Christian perspective. And without that design feature, without that intended connection, you're left with a cognitive, roulette. If you can kind of play Russian roulette. Hopefully you've never played Russian roulette, but you get the point, okay? You're trusting your brain because it seems to work, but you have no ultimate reason to trust why it works, okay? So I think that is a very useful internal critique, okay? And this is how I would put together the idea that we can contextualize Alvin Plantinga's argument here within a presuppositional framework. And here's the thing. As presuppositionalists who want to be faithful to Scripture in our apologetics, we are not arguing for a general theism, right? It's very important that we argue very specifically. We're not arguing in a piecemeal fashion, like the existence of God over here in isolation to these other considerations. We are arguing for an entire paradigm, okay, an entire worldview perspective. Okay. And that's why I keep repeating myself. Van Til defined apologetics as the vindication of the Christian philosophy of life, a Christian worldview over against a non-Christian worldview. Someone might say, well, atheism isn't a worldview. Fine. Any kind of atheism, an atheism that, if atheists don't all believe the same thing, take any form in whatever form atheism is, it's going to exist within a worldview context. And so, apologetics for us is going to be the vindication of the Christian philosophy of life over against any kind of manifestation of atheistic philosophy of life. Okay. So we're going to have to be able to argue from that worldview perspective. Okay. We want to be very careful because in our interactions with unbelievers, it's very tempting to be drawn out and argue for something in isolation. I remember in my discussion with Tom Jump, the atheist YouTuber, he said this. He said in our interaction, he said that I can grant the resurrection of Jesus, but that doesn't demonstrate that God is omnipotent. And so I hope you understand what he was trying to do there, okay? He was trying to pluck the resurrection of Jesus out of the worldview context in which it exists and in which it's defined and understood. Okay. And you can't do that. That is to move to a piecemeal approach, which is not what I was arguing for. You see, from my worldview, the resurrection doesn't make sense without the context of an omnipotent God raising Jesus from the dead. You see, my belief in the resurrection is connected to my belief in God and his attributes and his revelation. So we argue for the entire paradigm. You want to be very careful not to be plucked out. Don't let the unbeliever pluck a certain item out in isolation of the other resources of your worldview that actually contribute to properly understanding and defining the specific thing, right? The resurrection of Jesus is meaningless without the context in which it occurs, okay? For the resurrection of Jesus historically is not merely a historical event. It is a historical event that finds its definition within the context and backdrop of divine revelation. It is because of the Old Testament, okay, that we know that the resurrection has certain implications and importance and significance, okay? We don't just, Jesus rising from the dead, independent of the context in which it occurs, what we have is simply a historical anomaly. Someone was dead, came back to life, can't really draw any conclusions from that, okay? But that's not how the Bible presents the resurrection. The resurrection specifically occurs within a context in which that divine revelatory context of the Old Testament scriptures and so forth, the ministry of Jesus and the disciples and so forth, give it the context, meaning, and significance that it has. It is not just that a man rose from the dead. It is that Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, God incarnate, was crucified, was buried, and was raised on the third day, okay? And so it has a very specific meaning. It has very specific implications for mankind, okay? So we never want to take these things from a kind of like a isolated approach. And same thing, discussions over evolution or, I'm not just debating, if I'm talking to an evolutionist, I'm not just debating the facts surrounding evolution, but I understand that even what you believe about evolution and man's origin comes within a worldview context. And so while we can kind of, push data versus data, evidence versus evidence, the real issue is going to come down as to what? How we interpret that data. And then you get right back to the fundamental issue of worldview. Okay? So this is why you want to be very careful to think more broadly. Okay? Don't just think of the science. Yes, think of the science, do the science, argue the science, but always understand science within the broader framework in which science itself makes sense to begin with. Very, very important. All right. All right. Well, that is it for this episode, guys. I hope that this has been useful to you. And of course, if you have any more suggestions on videos you'd like me to cover, please feel free. I kind of posted my request to give me ideas on Facebook, and I kind of use Facebook a lot. Maybe I should make a post on YouTube too. Maybe I'll do that as well. But you could always either request something in the comments. If you request a topic, you can just say topic request in like all caps or something so that I could differentiate it from all of the regular comments and things like that. That's very helpful. If you have a specific question you'd like me to address, you could also email me at revealedapologetics@gmail.com, or you can contact me through my website, Revealed Apologetics. I'm sorry, I think I got that mixed up. Email me not at revealedapologetics.com. Email me at revealedapologetics@gmail.com, and then the website, revealedapologetics.com. Okay. Sorry if that sounded confusing. All right. So I definitely want to cover topics that you want me to address because I want this to be as useful as possible to you. So please, please, please reach out to me. I do read my email and I do read comments that stand out. So, if you ask your question like a jerk, I just skip over it. Okay. If you respectfully ask a question and it's not convoluted and it's not a 3-page essay, I skip over it. But if it is a clear, succinct, hey, can you address this issue because, and a few sentences, those are more manageable to me, not because I don't care what longer posts have to say. It's just an issue of time constraint. So if you want me to cover an issue, whether you're a skeptic or a Christian and you're saying, hey, I'm a Christian, but I was wondering about this thing, post it in the comments, preface it with question. If you're a skeptic or an atheist and say, hey, I want to hear you address this issue, put it in bold, here's my question, and then just lay it out there, and I will try my best to address those when I catch the time. All right? All right, well, again, I hope this is helpful, guys. I really appreciate it if you stuck with me this whole time. Until next time, take care. God bless. Bye-bye.